it's so important to think about the physical and the digital engagement as one integrated Congress experience. It's not separate tracks. It's really an integrated track. And the show floor, the exhibit physical floor is really just one touch point in a longer engagement journey.
Welcome to Transforming Medical Communications, a podcast by MedComms experts. We share medical communications insights and advice from the best and brightest in the industry to find out what they're doing to push our industry forward. Here's your host, Wesley Portegies.
Welcome to Transforming Medical Communications, the podcast where we explore bold ideas that shape the future of medical affairs. Conferences are often treated as one-off moments. But what if we would use them as strategic engines for launch readiness, global alignment, and HCP engagement? Well, today's guest has done exactly that. I am joined today by Madhura Shanmugasundaram. She is the Director of Global Medical Communications and Medical Affairs for Neuroscience at Takeda. She has led a global congress strategy for a pivotal asset that set a new benchmark for how medical affairs can show up at scientific meetings. In this episode, we'll explore how medical affairs can turn congresses into true strategic drivers ahead of launch. Madhura, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hi. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation with you here.
Glad to have you. So Madhura, let's dive right in. So when you think about congresses from a medical affairs perspective, what do you feel their role should be, and specifically in a pre-launch strategy, but in reality often isn't?
Yeah, congresses, especially when you think for medical affairs, is really very important not only to disseminate information. It's a great platform to increase the education or understanding of any unmet need or a disease state, particularly in pre-launch situation. But even after launch, you continue to have an opportunity to educate that scientific community. It's also obviously aligning on unmet needs within the patient population and the community, but also building a common language around emerging data or in the landscape, any mechanistic updates that you want to educate to people, the patient impact, and really creating that scientific shift in the narrative, I think, and the landscape as the momentum continues towards launch and beyond, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Now, what I've often seen, or how I feel about conferences when we work with our clients, it is often seen as kind of a isolated event, right? And it's understandable. We're busy, we're under a lot of pressure, big conferences coming up, so we kind of just want to get it out of the way. And then once it's out of the way, then the next conference comes up. And somehow that leads a little bit to this concept of isolated events. What would you say changes if you instead take more of a multi-month or multi-conference engagement journey rather than this isolated moment?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And you're right. I think that is something a lot of us think, even, or in my early days, I think that's how I thought about congresses. It's really important to ask a couple of questions, I think, as we look into this and plan these congresses is, what are we presenting at this meeting? And not just the data, but the totality of everything. What is the presence, right? And what should the audience really understand before they walk in and after they walk in? What are they clear about? What are the important key takeaways we want to leave? What is the one thing I want these attendees to have? So really defining the top priorities and helping to understand that this Congress is just a standalone event, but it's part of a journey. It's part of an educational journey. And that's what will drive for important Congress to raise up and elevate them. I think, there are a lot of metrics you can get after the Congresses also. So that kind of will feed into your whole education journey. That whole, Congress is just the 3 or 5 days is an event, but it's really part of a broader journey. And I think it's really important for everyone to recognize that and leverage that as you continue to educate.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, why don't we define the journey a little bit more together? So let's go piece by piece and talk about how someone could define or design a really high impact Congress strategy. So let's start at the beginning, which would be strategy. What are some of the first strategic decisions that medical affairs would need to make before thinking about the booth, the symposia, or, the resources to show there, but more from a high level perspective?
First, it's obviously a very, very cross-functional development and alignment, but medical affairs has a very key role to play here. One, determining, what is the scientific purpose of that particular Congress? So some Congresses are meant to educate about a disease. Some it's just about, deepening more into the mechanistic understanding of the disease, or others could just be about listening to the landscape. You just go there, listen, get your metrics to the latest updates. So understanding what is the purpose, being present at that Congress is one thing. Having very clear, I think, intent really set the guardrails for everything that's to follow. And second, really understanding, whatever your field is, what is the need there? What is the learning curve? What is the scientific landscape of that particular disease or the competitive landscape? What is it that you want to go there and achieve? I think, just aligning on that with the cross-functional team and as an organization before you enter your Congress. And are your healthcare providers still not clear about the disease state? Are they debating the mechanisms, for example? Or, are they ready to engage with endpoints and outcomes? Is that a conversation you can have? Or is it even just about talking about the differentiation? Or is it you have a portfolio of products in that disease? And is it about differentiating yourself? So I think trying to have that focus is super important. And also, how does this Congress fit in the broader picture? I think it's coming back to your earlier question, not only thinking about it just as a 3 or 5 day or, just one event, but if you're a global team across the regions, how does it feed into that? Or how does this feed into the broader big picture, not just thinking about the Congress days, but before and after, what does that mean? And the clarity that gives to your healthcare providers and attendees to that Congress. So it's really important to think about it very early on, having all these decisions made so it can have a very impactful Congress.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I like that. I'm just thinking while you were giving me that answer, where do we document this, right? Like, what is the central nervous system that kind of dictates some of these decisions or where this is documented? So, because you were also talking about geography, and then I was thinking about how do you actually make sure if other teams, maybe in other regions or in more like local events, represent the organization and the therapy, how do you make sure they all work in lockstep?
Yeah, I think the most important thing in probably any big project is collaborating early enough, having very defined goals, and maybe some things that when any global or strategy teams are working on assets for a particular Congress, thinking about how they can regionalize or localize these things with the regions or the local teams have enough budget, have enough resources to implement very similar sort of tactics in their, regional congresses. So thinking about how that can be extrapolated early on when the assets are being developed is very important. And of course, alignment and, the different regions would have different local needs which are unmet, and the portfolio of different products could be different. And the differentiation ask or messaging is also different. So aligning early on is something very important, not only from a global perspective, but also for the regions as they have better Congress strategies.
Yeah. Do you typically document the Congress strategy across Congresses? Just like we have an SEP, right? The Scientific Communications Platform. Is there something specific for Congresses? And could you tell me more about that?
Yeah, over the last 10 years or so that I've worked in medical communications and medical affairs, we've always, and most organizations have this in place where they actually sit down, they map out all the important congresses around the world and involve all the, local teams involved and really request them to think about what are their tactics they want to do in these regional congresses. So everything is mapped up very early on because it does have many implications. You want to have a very streamlined and aligned messaging across all of this. So there has to be one scientific narrative. The format may be different. The area where this congress may be different, but you want to have the same scientific narrative. And of course, that evolves over time, but it's an aligned scientific, messaging. So it's really, I think, imperative that teams get together early on, including global regions and, strategy and field, kind of putting together that message in place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so now we have that kind of playbook, right? How do you bring that to execution? I gave you the example of an SEP before, right? Like a scientific communications platform. What I would say most of the people agree with in the industry is that SEPs, we make them, they're important, but we're often not using them. How can we do that different when it comes to Congress planning?
I think it is sometimes a little bit of a challenge, but as I said, the most important thing is really having, timely check-ins with the regions. The launch may be very different. As I said, the landscape, the product availability, the payment, a lot of these things are very different across different countries. And it's really important, I think, just alignment and bringing through that scientific narrative. Sometimes the depth, you have a scientific narrative and in some place a scientific message. And sometimes we are able to go deeper in certain congresses where you speak a lot more about a disease state. And in some, you keep it high level. I think it also depends on, as I earlier said, the type of congress. Is it a general audience or a specific audience that you go to? So I think the important thing here is adapting that playbook, as you said. It's not going to be a one size fits all for all the regions and for all the teams. So really understanding how to adapt that to your local needs will be very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I think an added level of complexity is added when we talk about a pre-launch situation, right? Where we have there's perhaps a lot of scientific interest, but there's maybe not yet that much to show or not much that we're allowed to talk about. How do you decide what to say, what not to do, and what kind of criteria would you use to ensure that this still kind of makes an impact? Specifically, when it comes to this launch readiness, how does a conference play into that really well?
Yeah, I think in a pre-launch setting, it's a very gray zone. I mean, each country has a very different regulation around what you can share and cannot share. And I think what we've done in the past is really deciding what not to say is really just as important as deciding, what to include in your Congress strategy and so on. And it's very important to be very clear on the boundaries that you have. And of course, to base everything on science, because, we're still in the scientific business. So what is scientifically already established? What is the published literature in the landscape and what is still emerging? Are the mechanisms understood and so on? So understanding all these things and feeding into what you can actually say in these congresses. You have to be very careful of not showing something that can be misleading or risk being overthought. So those cannot be shared. And I know in general, we want to base it on scientific publications. So it would be very, misleading to say that there are certain claims you can make. Every team should be checking with your own local, regional, and regulatory colleagues as they make those things.
So something interesting, Matura, that I've been seeing really over the years is of course, omnichannel isn't new, right? But I think what is relatively recent is how these different channels converge. And what I'm specifically referring to here is we run a lot of digital work for medical affairs teams, right? Their digital presence, whether it is online platforms where HCPs can go and other things. And linking that to conferences is extremely successful and easy to measure as well. And I think that's such a cool thing to do, how, an online presence, social media, websites, and so on can kind of feed into the success of a conference. So I kind of wanted to ask you, what are your experiences with that? How do you see Congress engagement, kind of outside the show floor and integrating your physical presence with digital and social touch points?
Yeah, no, it's a very timely question. I mean, we're in a digital world, and I think with COVID, a lot of the congresses even went fully digital, right? We've seen that happen in the past. And I think it's so important to think about the physical and the digital engagement as one integrated Congress experience. It's not separate tracks. It's really an integrated track. And the show floor, the exhibit physical floor is really just one touch point in a longer engagement journey, an integrated journey, as we see. So the digital and social channels, they're used to extend and even amplify, I want to say, the scientific conversation that we have at the exhibit or during the Congress days. And it's not only after the Congress, I believe, even pre-Congress, these digital endpoints, they help to set the context sometimes and frame some of these key scientific questions or what's to come. And during the meeting, they enable this broader access to insights. And of course, after they're a rich source of metrics and insights that we can leverage to have that evolving scientific narrative. So really thinking of them as an integrated track, an integrated engagement journey rather than separate. I wouldn't even separate digital and the physical platform.
No, absolutely. And I think from a philosophical point of view, I completely agree. I would love, though, to get a little bit more practical here. And maybe you can tell me more about what does good or what does great look like, right? I don't know. I've seen it all from simple QR codes on posters or a booth to more integrated experiences. Like from your point of view, what is a really, really well executed Congress in this regard? Like what are some tactics and technologies that you have seen that you feel work well?
Yeah, I think you brought up a point about QR codes. It's something that a lot of teams are using these days. And I do think there are, certain limitations in terms of regulations with the different countries, but also not every team has enough budgets or resources to go broader. But having said that, I do think, leveraging digital tactics, and I think there's limited platforms we can use because of the scientific nature of this, but using some digital platforms to have a messaging that's before the Congress talking about, the booth or talking about the publications to come. Of course, you can't actually go into a lot more about the data there, but just giving a little bit of what's to come to targeted audiences, either through, I think some traditional methods like email, but also using some of the other social media. And then after that, and of course, during the Congress too, you can leverage social media to, see the digital engagement and what your digital thought leaders are sharing and communicating on. And of course, that follows through after as well in the post-Congress situation.
Mm-hmm. Is there any particular success story you can share on this, like a particular channel, social media platform, or applying social listening, or anything you really felt like, wow, this was way more impactful than I thought it would be?
Yeah, I think this is coming to that omni-channel approaches that we take, right? So maybe you can talk about social media listening. We've done that in the past and, some of the congresses that I've led. And I think during COVID, I want to think about a congress that I was a part of. And we saw, since particularly more so because we didn't have a physical floor, and we saw so much communication and engagement based on some publications that we had at the Congress. And you saw all these digital opinion leaders or KOLs really speaking to some of the key points and nuances from the conference and kind of tagging that back to their practice in real life. And I think that was very impactful. I think more than the quantity of the metrics that we get is really about the quality, right? So I think going into, what is it that's being discussed? How is the data or your presence being brought through after the Congress? How does it resonate with the scientific community? And I think social media listening was something very eye-opening for us because we wouldn't have gotten that metric had we not looked at the social media platform. So I think just simple things like that. It doesn't have to be, I think, very fancy technology. Sometimes it's very simple, easy to use, and very cost-effective measures.
Is MedComms evolving faster than your team can keep up? You're not alone, and you don't have to navigate it alone. Wesley Portegies, host of Transforming Medical Communications, is offering a limited number of free 30-minute consultancy sessions for medical affairs professionals. Whether it's medical communications, field medical, or medical affairs training, these sessions provide an opportunity to address your real-world challenges, pressure test ideas, and walk away with practical strategic insight for your team. No fluff, just strategy. Follow the on-screen link or in the show notes to book your free session now.
You mentioned email before as well. Can we get into that?
Yeah, I was talking about traditional emailing. Some of these congresses, they do allow you to be part of email lists ahead of the congresses, which kind of builds up that momentum to the Congress. And that's something, if the team is interested in, something they can look into and build up some sort of messaging that aligns to their overall narrative, that builds the traffic to either, some of their Congress tactics. So leveraging these already existing work processes would be very useful for companies too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of my favorite topic because I think email is so underrated. I think it's extremely powerful, even though it's used so much as it is. But I think in our industry on the medical affairs side, we can do more of it and actually really benefit from it. Another topic that I think is really intriguing, and I've covered this with a few previous guests recently in other episodes. If you think about it, two key channels that we use are conferences and field medical. Right? They're very, very effective and powerful channels. However, they target a very specific audience, right? Not every HCP is going to get an MSL to visit, and not every HCP is going to be able to go to the conference, especially if it's a larger national or international conference. And as a result, a lot of people you're actually not really hitting with those two channels, and you still need to find ways to reach them. And, when it comes to community physicians and so on, that's a challenge. And I think the digital integration can span beyond interacting with people that are at the conference or will be going to the conference or came back from the conference, but actually to the people that cannot go to the conference and wouldn't hear about it from an MSL either. What are your views on that?
Yeah, no, I think, as you pointed out, actually already in your question, I think a lot of the congresses are moving to a hybrid model. And I think COVID kind of helped with that. But we're very much in a hybrid model. So you're right. We can't target all the MSLs physically, or cannot engage with everybody, especially community physicians. And of course, all these congresses, they cannot target everyone. So really, then I think your golden tool here is digital tools, right? I mean, that's going to be the best way to do it. We spoke a little about the traditional email method, but I mean, beyond that, I do think there's a lot of CMEs that's digital. There's a lot of education that can be done digitally. And of course, the hybrid congresses, the other nice thing is most often than not, they're recorded. I think that's important for some people to know. I've noted some individuals who are not familiar with this format. They think that they have to attend live, but it's not necessarily the case. They can actually choose and pick the sessions they want to see after. So it's recorded, and the MSLs or the field medical can help guide some of these recorded conversations or curate those. So I think there's a lot of value in leveraging, I think, the digital aspects to this. You don't need to be there physically.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. What I really like about digital as well is that it's easier to have metrics, right? What is not so easy is to have metrics for your medical affairs congress booth. So you're here so I can ask the hard questions. So booth traffic, we know, right? And it's kind of a blunt metric. What other signals are there? Like when you set like a KPI strategy for a conference, like how does that look like? What are things you're looking for that indicate success to you?
That's a very challenging question in the field. I think it's something we've been tackling with for a while, understanding the metrics, right? And I think the challenge is because it's not easy to quantify or qualify them. I guess it's easy to quantify, but it's more about the quality of the metrics. And I mentioned about that a little earlier too. So the thing is, the signals you want to look for is really understanding any shift in the landscape, any shift in the treatment. And this is very hard to figure out, right? The learning and the impact is not quantifiable. And that's why I think there's a challenge with these metrics. But even so, I think it's still important to look at the quantity, the number of questions you're getting, say at the booth or the MSLs after a Congress, the medical information questions you're getting, but also the nature of these questions, the quality of these, like, are the HCPs or your stakeholders, are they asking any foundational questions? Are they asking questions about what is this disease state education? Or are they engaging in more very nuanced, deeper discussions? Are they asking about the mechanisms? Are they asking about your endpoints, your patient selection, how they can apply it in day-to-day with their patients? So I think the conversations moving from what is this to really how can I use this to impact, or how can I use this in my treatment guidance or thinking about my patients, I think that is probably one of the strongest indications of impact. And of course, if it makes it all the way to changing guidelines and so on, I think that's obviously an impact too. And it's very important to note also that these things don't change overnight after one Congress. Sometimes it takes a lot of time, which is why I think it's been a little challenging in the field to gather these metrics with people moving or teams evolving. Maybe simpler ways to look at it is, if a data or an information was shared in a Congress, is it showing up in the field? Are the MSLs hearing about this? Are the KOLs asking more about these publications, or are they asking more about a presentation that was done? Of course, social commentaries and the digital platforms. That's another pointer too. So all of this really, I think it's a totality of everything that's going on, and the metrics are there. I think we need to look at it a little deeper and longer, but we can get those metrics too.
Yeah, absolutely. So to circle back to the first part of your answer, you were saying like it's hard to quantify or assess the quality of those metrics. Have you been able to do any like that other than booth traffic?
Yeah. So I think when you get like MedInfo requests, really asking more about, say, a clinical data point, really asking more about, hey, I have this patient. Can I move on to this product of yours because I heard it's better? Or will this patient profile fit that product? So I think the moment you have physicians thinking a little bit more than just, what is it that you're doing? Or can I recruit in your trials because I'm really interested in it? I want to learn more about the patient selection. I want to learn more about this mechanism. I want to learn how this has a differentiated profile to another one that I'm using. I think the moment that you're creating this subtle change in thinking that you want them to think about, that's moving towards the messaging that you want to create.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I see where you're going with your answer, right? Like, and I think this is the typical scenario in medical affairs where leadership comes and say, hey, listen, was this conference worth the money? Right? And they kind of want to hear a clear ROI, which is close to impossible in medical affairs with non-economic value drivers. When you had to report the success of conferences to leadership, for instance, like how have you been going about that?
Yeah, and I think it's not only showing booth traffic metrics. I do think there is value in showing that also. But beyond that, as I say, it's the quality of the questions we're getting that really shows, I think, the importance that people are placing on the data or, on the presentation or even on the product that the team, that the company, the organization is working on. So having qualitative metrics, sometimes way more than the quantitative in this sense, and the type of questions that's being asked, sometimes it really provokes and evolves the scientific narrative of the organization, the kind of questions. And I think many times you also understand other unmet needs or to understand where you need to hone in more in terms of education, depending on the questions you're getting. So as long as it's progressing the way that the organization can move, either the metrics are showing that clearly there's a deeper understanding, there's deeper interest. I think that answers that question, for leadership. I do believe that that is the answer they're looking for.
Yeah, you're right. I'm just imagining that we have a conference. People ask questions to our booth staff. But then how are we going systematic about that, right? Because it can be very subjective. It's you could just make a round, say, well, what kind of questions did you get, right? But it's all very subjective. Have you seen any systematic approaches to this?
Yeah, actually, in the past organizations that I've worked in and what I've seen across many companies is mostly there's a systematic way to actually document these inquiries that we get at the booth. So it's not, you don't just stay there, get the questions and then come back and be like, oh, I think I got these questions on a mechanism or on the competitor profile or some things like that. But it's very well documented in terms of the questions you get. And then you can use that to get metrics. You categorize them, see, what are the top hits? Are people asking about your recent publication more? Are people asking about what is the next thing in development? Are they curious about your pipeline? Are they curious about any class of treatment? So I think digging in more into that really gives you some guidance and evolved messaging.
Yeah. So basically, this is a little bit like insight generation from the field medical team, but it's just on site with a different team, right? Or
Exactly.
partly different team. Okay, cool. So I was thinking, imagine that we have a global medical affairs team and they're preparing for their first major congress. Let's say, to just throw some other difficulties in here, they have limited resources as well, which I'm sure sounds familiar to many listeners. What would be 3 strategic priorities that you would insist on to really make sure that the conference and the effort here delivers real value for them?
Yeah, I think this is summarizing a lot of things I said, but it's really about, one, the clarity of the scientific intent, why that Congress is so important. So to be really explicit and aligned across the cross-functional teams, across everybody, and what is it that the Congress is meant to advance? Is it just a listening in Congress? Is it meant to differentiate yourselves from the portfolio that's existing? Is it about a deeper understanding of the disease or the mechanism, or just to educate the community on a particular aspect of the disease state? So really first having a very, very clear scientific intent to go to that Congress. Secondly, maybe focusing on the high quality of scientific engagement over scale. You mentioned very limited resources. And I think that's fine. You may not even need a booth, or you may not even need very fancy tactics there, but having sometimes very impactful publications, having obviously more impactful presentations there is going to really shine more. So prioritizing deeper engagements, not really spreading out then and doing everything, but really just prioritizing some of the deeper engagements and interactions more so than a volume-driven approach. And even if you don't have any of that, really having very strategic KOL engagements maybe, So really just, I think, honing in on what is it that the team wants, the clarity there on the scientific intent, having more deeper engagements more so than volume-driven activity. And then perhaps thirdly, when we think about the omni-channel and everything too, really having a very defined pre and post plans. You have that early on. I think it's really important to have, what is it that I'm going to do before the Congress? What is it that I'm going to align before the Congress? What is it that I'm going to do during and after? And the metrics that follows through and the insights generated, that's going to help you to inform the next phase of the strategy and evolve your Congress strategy. Perhaps it was all well received. So maybe then, you can think about a little bit more in your next Congress with your budgets, or think about something else you could do. So I think really just having that clarity, focusing on the high quality rather than the scale, and thirdly, really having very defined and aligned pre and post Congress plans as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that. I fully agree with you. I often see that with projects where you kind of go into it and the actual purpose isn't really clear, right? So let's start making a slide deck together about something. And I'm sure it's important and good, but like at the same time, it's like, why are we actually really doing this? And I think that why, it maybe heard about this like 5 times why rule, right? Like to say, if you ask the why question 5 times, you get deeper, then you're actually at the level why something is really important. So you're saying, get at that the why first, then design around that in a way that focuses really on great execution versus quantity, right? Quality over quantity.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then make sure you communicate around that like really well by doing pre, during, and post conference communications that are optimized. Yeah, I like that. So one more question for you. Imagine that you had a magic wand, right? And there is like one industry habit around conferences that you could change. What would it be? What is something that you maybe look at and say like, well, this is often done wrong, or like, I wish people would know that this and that would be more effective?
Yeah, it's really about treating congresses as part of a continuum. There's really a before, after, during, and even thinking of it as what happened in the last Congress, what's happening in the next Congress, what's happening next year and the year prior. So really thinking of it as a continuum, I think, is something we fail to think about sometimes because we're so into each Congress and each tactic as we work on. So really changing the habit of treating these as isolated events or training events rather than like milestones in this larger scientific continuum, larger scientific journey that the organization is doing. So I think that will also help to elevate the medical affairs and the value that we will be able to bring in this setting too.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. This was such a insightful conversation. And for anyone listening, I know Congress season is coming up. So hopefully if you listen to this, there's 1 or 2 nuggets of gold here that you can apply in your planning. That would make us extremely happy. If you want to, let us know if that's the case. Mathura, thank you so much again for being here today. Thanks for sharing your insights. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Transforming Medical Communications is brought to you by MedComms Experts. To find out more about MedComms Experts and how we create some of the most cutting-edge medical communications programs anywhere in the world, visit www.medcoms-experts.com. And then make sure to search for Transforming Medical Communications in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at MedComms Experts, thanks for listening.